Welcome back to Andersen Acres. Today we are going to make cinnamon raisin loaf. Cinnamon raisin loaf is excellent. I'm sure everyone has bought it at the store, but you can actually make it at home really easily, and you don't even have to add any actual sugar. So let's get started and see how this goes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use our bread maker, simply because I'm simultaneously making sourdough bread, which I cannot make in the bread maker. So when I'm making two things like that, it's kind of like when I'm making ciabatta, I'm also making something using the bread maker, just because it is a little bit of a change of pace. It does more of the work for me, and for the breads that I can't use the bread maker for, I just, have to live with that. It's fine. But I have so little time, especially right now, that I'm going to use my bread maker. So in our bread maker, the first thing we are going to add is 1 cup of milk. Okay, I use a 2% milk. You can use a whole milk. Do not use 1%. It doesn't go well. I'm also adding half a cup of rolled oats. It gives your bread a nice texture. Okay, it's really quite lovely. I'm also going to have 2 to 3 tablespoons of butter. You can use margarine if you like. I don't sub out in this recipe, but you can. I'm going to add a teaspoon of salt. Okay, you don't want to skip the salt because the salt actually gives this bread a lot of its flavor. Even though it's not a salty bread, the salt punches the flavor up, so don't skip the salt. In this little bowl, I have about a teaspoon of cinnamon and half a teaspoon of nutmeg. You can reduce the nutmeg to 1/4 teaspoon if you want, but you definitely want at least the cinnamon. It punches up your flavor again. For our flours, we're going to do 2 cups of white flour, 2 cups of white flour, and we're going to do 1 cup of whole wheat flour. Okay, it goes really nicely in this bread. Whole wheat flour is perfect for cinnamon raisin bread. We're going to add a heaping teaspoon of yeast. And this is ready to go in the bread maker. You might go, wait, you didn't add the raisins. It's true, I didn't. I've got the raisins here to the side. So the thing with the raisins is if I put them in here now, they might get a little bit smushed in the bread maker. So we're not going to do that. We're going to leave the raisins out. We're going to set a timer for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to add the raisins to the dough after it's mixed for a little bit. If your bread maker has a buzzer that tells you when to add fruit and nuts, you should use that. It may even have a dispenser. So use that if you can. Mine has a dispenser, but it does not function when you're on the dough cycle, which is a little bit irritating, so I do it manually. So I'm setting a timer for 10 minutes. If you're making this bread by hand, you knead in the raisins at the end, just to make sure that they don't get all smashed up while you're kneading the dough initially. So these will go in after about 10 minutes. This goes in the bread maker now. The bread maker will handle the mixing, kneading, and the first rise of the dough for me. So we will come back in about an hour and a half and catch up with our dough. All right, so our cinnamon raisin dough is complete. At least it's completed its first rise. So what we're going to do now is we're going to prep our pan, and we are going to use a bread pan for this, just because it works best. So we're just going to use a little canola oil spray. I don't need very much because it's a silicone pan, and silicone doesn't really stick. You will need a little more if you're going to use a glass pan or a metal pan. Now, you do not have to use cooking spray. You can use flour and a little butter in the pan to keep it from sticking. It doesn't really matter. So we're just going to shape, make sure you push all the air bubbles out of your dough first, but we're going to shape it into a loaf. And we're going to use this to measure how long we want to make our loaf. So we want to try to keep it the same thickness. So you don't want like really pointy little ends or anything. You want nice, even. Pinch your dough together if you need to, but you want to get all your seams pretty well sealed because you don't want them coming open. And then we're going to kind of flatten it a little bit just to help it spread. And then we're going to stick it right in our loaf pan. So that's our cinnamon raisin ready to go, and it has to rise for probably an hour and a half because it does have all that whole wheat flour and it does have the raisin in it. So it'll take a little bit longer to rise. So we're going to set this aside for about 90 minutes in a warm, damp location. I use the microwave because it's warm and it's damp. You can simply cover it with a damp paper towel and maybe even plastic wrap on top of that so that it rises appropriately. You want it to about double in size. So we will come back in about 90 minutes and check and see how much it's risen. All right, so our cinnamon raisin bread has risen up. You'll notice it doesn't rise quite as much as some of the other breads. It'll rise a little more in the oven, but it's normal for a cinnamon raisin to be a little more dense than some of your other breads. So this is going to go in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 25 to 30 minutes, depending on your oven. I usually check it at 25 minutes, but be prepared to leave it for 30 if you want a slightly darker crust. So 375 degrees, 25 to 30 minutes. We'll come back when it's done. And there we have it, our cinnamon raisin loaf. It's perfect to have as toast in the morning, or just smear a little bit of jam or even just some butter on it and enjoy just the way it is. You might want to let it cool for 15 to 20 minutes before you slice, but after that, enjoy. Thanks for joining us here today. I hope you decide to make cinnamon raisin bread at home. Until tomorrow.